What a terrible device this is. It's my addiction, and probably a lot of your addiction. We unlock our cell phones about 150 times per day. Do you guys want to take a guess how long the average person spends on their cell phone every day? You can shout it out. Just a guess. 4 hours. So the average person spends 5 hours a day on their phone. And if you're a young person, it's a lot longer. It's up to 8 hours a day. So imagine if your application that you built had users addicted to it 5 to 8 hours a day. That'd be a huge success. And it's just incredible that we do that. How many of you use your cell phone as an alarm clock? You put it on your nightstand? Almost everybody. So I used to do that. And I'm a CEO of a company, so I'm addicted to this phone. So what would happen to me is every night, I would try to go to bed, but I would check email, I'd get on YouTube, and then 4 hours later, I was drug into the YouTube universe where I was looking at news, and my sleep was ruined. So one of the things I did is I started to charge my phone in a different room, and I bought an Amazon Alexa. Does anyone have an Amazon Alexa? So yes, I installed a listening device in my bedroom, and I'm a security practitioner. I'm aware of this. So every night, I tell Alexa, Alexa, set an alarm for 5:45 a.m. I do not get up at 5:45 a.m. That is a goal. So I tell Alexa, be quiet about 5 times. My wife groans. She's like, why do you do this? It's a goal I have. But that's my morning routine. And it's helped me get the phone away from me. So what I do in the morning next is I go downstairs and I make coffee. So this is supposed to be kind of my quiet moment, my no technology. I intentionally do it slow. It is not my quiet moment. Instead, what I do is I get my cell phone and I check email, I get on LinkedIn, I look at my calendar, I start preparing for the day. So that's my typical morning. For this particular trip, this last week, I had to fly into Paris. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, on the east coast of the US. Atlanta has the busiest airport in the world. There's about 275,000 passengers per day, which means our security line can sometimes take about 2 hours. And if you've ever been through security in America or in Atlanta, there's this big machine that you have to walk through to get through security. And what you have to do is you have to walk. They tell you to put your hands up like this, and there's a scanner. It goes, and they make sure you don't have anything on you that you're not supposed to. And if you're good, you can go right through. So it's a huge bottleneck. It can take like 2 hours. Get on the flight, 8-hour trip to Paris, all good. When I got to Paris, I wanted to do some work. So in my particular field, we're pretty virtual, like most of us are. We're very reliant on SaaS applications. So Microsoft Teams, Zoom, Jira, whatever I'm using to work. That's my typical day. The average company has about 182 third-party vendors. So keep that in mind. And the average person has about 80 apps on their phone. So we're heavily reliant on third parties. The way I like to kind of decompress from the day is doing a run. I use another tracking device to do my run often. I'm training for a marathon right now. So we have a community that we started a group on an application called Strava. We can kind of track each other, encourage each other. But what Strava does is it tracks a lot of your health data, so like your heartbeat, your fitness routines. It also has your GPS location. So another tracking device that I'm happy to use. And I don't think my day is much different than any of your days. We all use a lot of the same applications. We are becoming, ultimately, digital people. There's a digital version of myself. And what's interesting is a lot of these companies know a lot more about me than I probably know about myself. You can take Strava. An interesting thing about Strava, for example, is I often start and finish my runs in front of my house. So I walk up my door and just do a run. And one thing I noticed was if you look at my running history, you can see where I live. And I can also see where the people I follow live because they start and finish at the same time. You can figure out how healthy I am. You can find my email, my contact information. There's some studies that show if you look at people's search histories, for example, that you can pretty easily tell their political orientation, even their sexual orientation. So, everything about me, theoretically, is digital. So that's all of us. I'm living a very normal life, but digitally, I have a footprint. So what does all this mean for us? So I think we are currently in an era of digital trust. We give away our data to companies and people, but we have an expectation that those companies will be good stewards of that data. It's a fair expectation that we have. We expect that they'll protect it, that they'll use it judiciously, but that's not always the case. So let's talk about Amazon a little bit, to pick on them. So a couple interesting things are happening with Amazon. We know that they have listening devices, the Alexa that I use. Part of what Alexa does is it will store the voice tracks. So it'll take a transcript of those voice tracks, store them digitally. They say they use it for troubleshooting purposes. And one of the phenomena that's happening in America, and maybe elsewhere, is that law enforcement are subpoenaing those records for criminal activity to see if they can get evidence or to see if anything interesting is on those files. And they can actually do that without a warrant. So Alexa and Amazon, they do push back, to their credit. They rarely will do that unless there's a warrant to do that. But it raises an important societal question. Where's the line of privacy? Is it okay that they do that? Are we even aware that they're doing that? And then Amazon also has a device called a Ring doorbell. And that basically is a doorbell with a camera that stores all of that data in the cloud. And we're seeing the same phenomena. Law enforcement is requesting this camera footage for criminal prosecution. And this is our home. Is that okay? So this is a conversation that society needs to have. Our technology is past the point of what we've decided, is it okay that we're doing that? I mentioned I use LinkedIn. I post every day. I look at LinkedIn a lot. In 2018, the entire user base was compromised. There was basically a front-end application, web scraping, where an attacker got the email address, the phone numbers, the names, the company that the people were working for all 200 or 740 million users at the time. So why is that important? So if you hate getting spam email, if you've ever been attempted to be social engineered, if you've ever gotten a robocall, imagine if you could instantly have access to 740 million people with their job titles and the companies they're associated with. So this is a big deal. And LinkedIn's associated with Microsoft, so we have an expectation that this wouldn't happen to them. I mentioned in Atlanta, and in all the airports in the US, you go through these body scanners that scan you. And when they first rolled that out, I don't think people generally liked that. It just felt weird. It felt intrusive. Then a whistleblower who actually worked for the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration in the US, wrote an article and said, hey, we're actually seeing you naked. And it was a huge controversy. And this brings into questions, how did that happen? Like, someone had to approve this. They built the machine, they tested it, they rolled it out, and at no point did no one say, why? Why are you doing this? So it's another important conversation about society and trust. They ultimately did remove these machines. There was about 250 and installed new machines, but it still raises those questions, how did this happen? I mentioned Strava. So it has your GPS location in addition to some health data and other things. One of the interesting things that happened to Israeli and American soldiers were that insurgents were using Strava to find out where military bases were. Because in the middle of nowhere, in the Middle East or wherever, they would see soldiers that were running places, which were indications that military bases were there. So it's these unintended consequences of technology that impact us that I don't think we do a good job fully thinking through the implications. So I think there's three trends. Like we know that we're digital humans, we're sharing data, we're seeing these headlines, everyone's basically cognizant of this. So I think there's three trends shaping cybersecurity and ultimately impacting your business. And I'll talk about the implications for your business here in a moment. So there's three trends. There's mass data creation, there's data sharing, and then there's the cyber threat. So on the data collection piece, every day we create, as an individual, about 150 gigabytes of data. That is, for context, about 36,000 books. And that's largely from IoT devices, our cell phones, the apps that we use. And because of this mass data creation, it's creating a very lucrative environment for both companies to monetize that data, but also cyber criminals to try to steal that data. And this number is only increasing exponentially. So that's one important trend. The second trend is data sharing. I mentioned that the average company shares data with about 182 third-party vendors. So that means that it's not just your company you have to worry about, it's 182 third parties that you also have to worry about. And an interesting thing that we know is that over 50% of all cybersecurity breaches originate with third parties. So if you have 182 third-party vendors, maybe you're doing all the right things. There's a really good chance that they're going to have your data breached and you'll be on the hook for it. The third trend that I think is impacting everything is the cybersecurity economy, both criminal and professional. So from a criminal standpoint, they're estimating that by 2025, the criminal element of cybersecurity will be a $10 trillion opportunity. On the other side of that, organizations are spending about $300 billion to protect themselves. So let's think about that asymmetry for a second. You have a $10 trillion opportunity and companies spending $300 billion to protect it. Both are huge numbers, but I think it's pretty easy to see why cybercrime is so lucrative and such a great opportunity and is not going anywhere. There was another study done that said cybercrime is on pace to quickly outpace drug trafficking. So it'll make it the most lucrative criminal activity that you can do. So we have these three trends in the marketplace. Huge amounts of data creation. Then we're sharing all that data with our third parties. And there's a lot of money to be made if you're a cyber criminal. So what does this mean for your business? So I think there's another three trends with businesses. And this is the playbook. So from my experience, especially in the engineering world, more technical people, like everyone pretty much raised their hand when they agreed that cybersecurity was a priority. Then when Jonas asked, how many of you feel good about your cybersecurity posture, people put their hands down. So why is that? There's a couple reasons that happens. And one of the reasons is because technical people are always great at pitching security to executives. Why should you invest in cybersecurity? So if that's a challenge you're having, these 3 points I'm about to give you will be the talking points that you can take back to your organization. But there's three major business impacts that we're seeing virtually across all of our clients that I've ever served. One of these three things are their priorities. And they want to, one, protect themselves from the cyber threat. Two, they're worried about customer trust. And number three, regulatory environment. So I'll talk about each of these three and some action steps that you can take. So number one is the cyber threat. So pretty much everyone in this room, I think this is intuitive. Of course you don't want to get breached. Like, you know that. That's the reason most people think that they're doing cybersecurity. It's like, I don't want to get breached. And that's a very good reason to do this thing. That's the ethical, good reason to want to build a security program. And the fact is, whether you're a small company or a large enterprise, there's virtually 100% likelihood that you're going to be tested, meaning a cyber criminal is going to try something against your organization. So one of the things that happens at Risk 360 is every new hire that comes on board at our company, pretty much the first day that they start work, they receive a text message and or an email from me. It's not actually from me. And it's usually trying to get them caught up in some kind of social engineering scheme. So the text might say, hey, I'm sitting at this is Christian, I'm sitting at a conference, and I need you to go buy an Amazon gift card because I want to give them out to someone. And if you're a brand new, anxious new hire, there's a really good chance that you might go do that and then send me pictures of it. But it's not me texting you. They just stole the gift cards from you. So what we have to do is pre-hire, before someone is even hired, we have to tell them, hey, if you get emails or texts from me, Slack me and make sure it's actually me. I will not ask you to buy gift cards. So that's how far ahead of it we have to get. I think what's happening is someone is monitoring LinkedIn, and every time someone changes their job title, an automation kicks in where they're doing this social engineering campaign. And by the way, that's not because Risk360 is special at all. This is one of the most common things that we see across all organizations. They're looking for job changes to initiate those types of activities. So what can you do? So largely it's going to depend on where you're at in your security journey. So let me start here. The number one thing that you can do as an organization is establish a culture of security. And I don't know if that feels intuitive to you, but the bottom line is if you're a leader, you need to be willing to put time and resources and lip service into security. And sometimes that means slowing things down. Sometimes that means making business decisions that don't feel good because I need to do the right thing from a security perspective. If you're an engineer, sometimes that means not pushing to prod because it's not ready. I have to do more testing. There's an important feature the client is demanding. I have to slow down to make sure it's done right. Those are really hard business decisions to make, but that's why that culture of security is so important. It means training all of your new hires about phishing emails, talking about security, keeping it top of mind. So it costs you nothing to do this, but it's probably the number one thing that any organization can do to boost their cybersecurity posture. A couple other things I'll mention if you're just getting started is one, just use the tools you have. Fully implement and leverage the existing tool base you have. Whether that's enabling MFA or doing better testing or editing the configuration settings in your infrastructure, whatever that is, fully use the tools that you have. Again, it's another thing that costs you nothing except for your time and some thought. One other thing I'll mention, if you're not already doing this, and this will come up again later, is consider doing vulnerability scanning and penetration tests. Sometimes that's very revealing in terms of your overall maturity. It's also a good tool that you can use to communicate with leadership. Hey, we have some significant issues here. We're not as mature as we thought we were. If you're looking to take your program to the next level, ultimately what you need to do is do a risk assessment because you need to know where you're currently at and what you need to invest in. So if you've never done a risk assessment for your organization and you don't really know what your vulnerabilities are, where you should be investing in, that's a good activity to do. And then based on that risk assessment, you're going to build a security roadmap and implement that roadmap. That takes more investment, but if you're ready for maturity, consider that. The second thing that's impacting your business is customer trust. So I mentioned on the onset that everyone thinks they're doing security to prevent the breach. But that's not really the business driver of why people are building security programs. From my experience, the reason people put real money behind security programs often is because there's a contract on the line. There's a customer that said, hey, you have to do these security things if you want to do business with me. And customers are looking to mitigate their own risk. They have 182 third parties they're sharing data with. They have to feel very confident in that data sharing. So they're putting it in contracts. This is an example contract that Risk360 got. We're actually ISO certified ourselves, so we're a security organization that gets audited ourselves. And we have clients that require us to do that. They won't do business without us, especially as you move up market to more enterprise clients. So you have to have mechanisms to prove out customer trust to support the business. So if you're trying to make a business case to your CEO or someone else in your organization on why security matters, you can give them some confidence that this is what we have to do to move to the next level. To have customer trust and move up to the enterprise, to close those deals that we want to do, it's about customer trust. So what can you do? So if you're just getting started, there's a couple action steps. First thing is consider putting together a vendor transparency report. That's a marketing document that fully discloses your security posture to potential customers and partners. It can be a nice marketing document. It's an act of good faith. You're trying to be transparent. You're trying to communicate to them the risk, what you're doing to take security seriously, and customers really appreciate that. I bet a lot of people in this room have probably been part of like a customer audit, or they sent an Excel spreadsheet and asked you to fill out a bunch of questions to do business with them. Another thing you can do is go ahead and fill one out in advance. One of the things we do at Risk360 is we put a whole vendor transparency package together because we're expecting our customers to ask us about security, so we proactively present that to get ahead of the questions they're going to ask. I mentioned vulnerability scanning and penetration testing earlier. It's going to come up here too. pretty much the #1 artifact that our customers ask, besides certification, is copies of our vulnerability scans or an executive summary of our penetration test. So it's good security hygiene to do those things. It's the right thing to do, but it's also rapidly becoming a customer expectation. So consider those things. If you're really moving up market and you're getting enterprise clients, what's likely going to happen is you're going to have to get formal certification. So we're the audit firm that does platforms, security certifications, and they get many of them. They have like 4 or 5. So that is a maturity step. You need to position yourself where you're capable to get certified if you need to. There's a couple big players. SOC 2 is a reporting type. It's larger in the US. And then ISO 27001. Those are probably the 2 most popular. But there's different certifications you might want to consider based on industry or region. So the third thing that's impacting your business is the regulatory and compliance environment. So what we're seeing globally is because there is some awareness of the cybersecurity problem, of the privacy problem, countries are trying to put regulations in place to solve that problem, to drive some action. The best example of that is GDPR, where in France everyone has heard of GDPR. It's also impacting the US because people use 182 vendors, so somewhere along that supply chain there's regulatory requirements, but there's many others. So what do you do how do you get ahead of regulatory compliance? Because no one wants to, I haven't really seen a company that's proactive about becoming compliant to a regulation. So you have to do some kind of analysis. So what are some action steps? So the first thing I would do if I'm trying to understand regulatory applicability is do a quick examination. What regions are you operating in? If I'm in Europe, I'm thinking about GDPR for sure. If I'm in the United States, I know that they have state-by-state privacy laws as well as some national ones, so I need to take that into strong consideration. If I'm serving a certain vertical, for example, if I'm in financial services, maybe I need to consider banking regulations or something like PCI. If I'm in the healthcare vertical in America, I need to worry about HIPAA or other regulations. So if you're preparing your organization for regulatory compliance and future complexity, those are the kind of things that you want to be talking to your executive team about. Which markets are we going to be serving? Which industry verticals? Who are we selling into? How do I prepare the organization? If you're an engineer, you need to be part of those conversations because there's certain things that you can't undo easily. For example, GDPR has data regionalization or localization requirements. So that's a really difficult problem for US companies because maybe I'm hosted in AWS East, US East region, but I have a data localization requirement for Germany. But I haven't built my application in a modular format so I can easily put the data in Europe. So those are conversations you need to have early, and it's a strategic conversation you can have with leadership to get ready. So I'm going to give you a couple tools here. So I mentioned who Risk 360 is. So we've spent the last 7 years doing this stuff, building compliance and security programs for tech organizations. We issue certifications. We help build security programs. The reason that matters to you is because we've built an application called Phalanx. And if any of you are curious about what your current security posture is, am I aligned to ISO or SOC 2, you can use this application for free, and you can take a survey, and it will generate a report card for you, as well as recommendations. So in this audience, maybe you care about ISO 27001. You can select that framework. We've made the questions human readable. You'll get a report card, and then it'll give you some advice on how to start aligning to that, and it might spark some ideas. This is completely free to use, and you can check it out. You do have to apply for it, so if you're interested in that, I'll leave this up. But I appreciate it. I'm going to open it up for questions for a few minutes, too, because I'm sure there will be some. But thank you guys for listening.
Thank you, Chris. Do we have questions? It's hard to see, actually. I have one. Oh. So you do a lot of assessments with customers, right?
Yep.
So what is the weirdest story?
So there are a few. that I could talk about. So I'm going to talk about a weird story, and then I'm going to talk about one thing that's common that maybe everyone's not tracking. So a weird story is one time we had to break into a listening device, a piece of hardware, and it was associated with software as well. And the listening device actually goes into doctors' offices, and the use case is the doctor can transcribe notes as they're doing their work, and they can review those notes later, blah, blah, blah. So our labs team is taking apart this device, and it was built on a Raspberry Pi. There is a superglued piece into it, so we just unsuperglue it. And I'm working in an open office space, and all of a sudden I hear my voice coming back over to me. And I'm like, where does that come from? And it's like the device, we just broke into it in like 10 minutes. So that was pretty scary in the fact that someone's very private conversations were that accessible to something that's in a lot of doctors' offices. To make matters worse, is this device is communicating back to AWS in the cloud where the recordings are ultimately stored. And the credentials to get into the AWS environment were hard-coded in the device.
Of course.
So we were able to get access to the cloud too. The reason that is scary is because literally thousands of doctors were using this device in some very sensitive type of doctor's offices. And it's scary to know that that had mass adoption and was out there. So that was a weird one. Something that is probably more applicable to most of you is there's a lot of things that I think when we think of security, we often think of it as a technical problem. So engineers in this room, you're probably worried about my API getting hacked or a vulnerability in the source code. Those are legitimate concerns, but they're really not the top concerns. Stuff I see happening more often is like social engineering, like relying on the courtesy of someone. Maybe I'll call your help desk and establish a relationship over the course of a month and then get credentials because they're just trying to be helpful and they give them to me. Or there's another thing, everyone thinks because they have MFA enabled, that's bulletproof. That's a great step. You should be taking that step. But we're seeing like something called MFA fatigue, where an attacker will get the credentials, and then they'll just start hammering your phone until you're like, I'm tired of getting this alert. And you're like, fine, approve. And all of a sudden they have access to whatever they're trying to get access to. So I think that's where that awareness comes in. It's like, it's hard to fight the human instinct to be a decent person, to be helpful, to open the door to someone. And when you're on the other, a helpful person versus a criminal who's willing to lie and cheat and steal, that's an unfair battle because they're going to manipulate you, and that's really hard to stop. A lot of the big breaches that you hear at the major corporations had some kind of social engineering component of it, and we do that too when we do penetration testing. You know, our labs guys, they just go in and lie. They'll walk into the door, pretend like they're part of the conference, steal a backpack, and that's the stuff that's really, really hard to combat.
It absolutely makes sense. I think I heard at some point a quote that totally made sense to me. Is that we're not getting hacked or we're not getting social engineered because we are stupid, but because we are humans.
Yeah.
And that's exactly, I think, what you mentioned here, right? Up for question. I think we have a question down there. Do we have a microphone? Yeah, we do.
You talked about the cost, the investment. Like, do you have like statistics from like best performing organizations about like what percentage of engineering effort is actually tied directly to security, and whether like how many in an engineering team of 10, 20, 40, how many should be like actual people with the title security engineer?
So I do have some statistics. I don't know if they're good. I don't know if it's the right way, but I'll tell you what people are doing. So one thing we know is Fortune 500 companies are spending like $100 million a piece on security. So most of us are not Fortune 500 companies, but we know that is a number. That's a benchmark. It's a big number. For most smaller organizations, there are certain ratios that exist. So for example, one ratio that keeps coming up is for about every 50 engineers, you have one full-time security person. So that's a number that comes up. If you're highly regulated or you're dealing with some very sensitive data or something, those ratios will change where you have more security people. But on average, that's what we're seeing. I don't claim that that's enough. Like you have an organization of 200 or 500 security engineers and you have 3 people working on security, and that usually includes the compliance elements of it. I don't know if that's sufficient, but that's the level of investment I think most organizations are willing to make. We even see some small organizations. I mean, if you hire in the US a few security engineers plus the tool sets, you're getting into multi-million-dollar programs very quickly with salaries and tools that you need. And I think most organizations view that right off the margins. That's not going towards new features or products that customers want. So those are difficult business decisions. I mentioned that security is a cultural thing. Well, CEOs and CTOs need to be willing to make those investments that on the surface aren't going straight to the customer, that's maybe more protecting the business. So, but those are some of the ratios that we see.
So from the people in the room and the engineering people in the room, which companies, and raise of hands again, which companies do have dedicated security roles even, or is it just something that engineers do side by side? So let's do, which one have security roles dedicated in their company? And which ones is it just part of the engineering work, offloaded kind of?
Yep.
Okay, that seems like 50-50 even.
Those are huge challenges too, because one of the things that makes security really difficult is when there's structural problems in the ecosystem. What I mean by that is, for example, if your whole business model is based on monetizing data, that makes it very difficult for you to make decisions about privacy. Similarly, if your whole engineering team is motivated toward getting new features and products to the marketplace, asking them to slow down and build in security is a very unnatural motion. So that's why we see these asymmetries with security, because sometimes you have to do things that do not feel like they're in your interest to do in order to slow down and do security. And those are systemic problems that are very difficult to solve in the industry.
That sounds about right. Okay, there's one more question here. I can go down with the microphone.
So question here is, so do you think the cloud itself is a threat entry point, and replacing it with self-managed, these third parties, for example, might solve the problem, or it opens up actually other problems? Yeah.
So the cloud's an interesting phenomena. So it's not, I mean, there's some good things about the cloud in terms of inherent security capabilities, but also like we find open S3 buckets all day where someone did something and for ease they just left it open, so those are vulnerable by their very nature. We see managed security providers like Platform that you get a lot of benefit from because you can kind of piggyback off the good stuff that they're already doing that you don't have to think of. So there's like a careful balance, like between the self-hosted options where you're configuring and managing everything and you can make it open or closed as you please, versus sitting on top of someone else's platform and piggybacking off of the good stuff they're already doing. So I think the answer is I don't think that the cloud is inherently more secure or by itself secure. I think that because almost every client we have, we're pen testing their cloud environment and we're getting in. But there are some things that become easier because you're on the cloud or because you're using a platform to secure yourself. So it's a balance, it's a thoughtful approach. I think it gives you more capabilities, but you still have to think through it.
Perfect. I see no more hands. Oh, there's one.
So I have a general question. What would you recommend if somebody wants to get started into cybersecurity? How can you improve your learning process?
Clarification, do you mean as an individual or as a company?
Good question. Both.
Okay, so as a company, you got to do some kind of assessment. Unless you're a security expert, you kind of feel like you don't know where to start and what to prioritize. So some type of assessment is a good place to start. That can be a self-assessment, that can be a penetration test. You can engage a firm to do a third-party assessment and put together a roadmap on your behalf. So I think that's, if you're really trying to get to the next level of security, you need somebody to do that, that's an expert. So from a company perspective, I think that's a good place to begin if you've already kind of implemented all the tools that you have at your disposal and you feel like you're at your limit. From an individual perspective, one thing I love about the security community is, and really technical community in general, is everything's open. So you can go to YouTube, you can there's something called Try Hack Me. There's these like boxes that you can hack into. There's free labs that you can use too. So if you Google free lab environments, you can do that if you're interested from a technical perspective. There's also some awesome open source tools. I'll name some of them. So there's one called Scout Suite. So if you're in any of the big cloud providers, there's an open source tool where you can scan your own cloud infrastructure and it'll come back with a very intuitive report about like what might be misconfigured or be a security concern. So that's a worthwhile tool. There's also an organization called CIS, Center for Internet Security, they put out these benchmark reports. So it's the same type of thing where you can assess your configuration settings. They also have a really good practical security framework. So if you just don't know where to begin, you can kind of start reviewing yourself against that framework. And there's many, many open source libraries out there that you can kind of do your own scans and stuff. So I think a good Google search and looking at the resources available are a good place to start.
Perfect. That brings us right on time.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks for all the questions. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.